Super happy to be here. My training is communication, so the kinds of things that I'm interested in are really how people use online technologies to form and maintain social relationships. I've done some work looking at self-presentation strategies in online dating, the social capital work that Michael talked about, some work trying to think about social network sites and how they're different from previous technologies. And the work that I'm sharing today is a piece that's actually published already. It's in JCMC, and I'll show you the site later. And so what I wanted to do was, since the methodological and empirical stuff is already out there, I thought what I would do is to kind of take it a little bit more high level and maybe do a little bit more of the kind of intellectual motivation and thinking at a higher level than really just focusing on the, kind of narrow slice of the paper itself. So when I was going to give this talk a year ago, I gave a version of this at Mozilla. And so this was March, of 2020. And I showed this slide, and in my notes, I have what I was going to say, or what I said back then, which was, with this new coronavirus, it seems a little silly to worry about things like loneliness and low self-esteem, but these things do matter for quality of life and have health consequences as well. So the kind of high level motivation for this talk is kind of better understanding implications of social media use for well-being. And at the time, I kind of felt the need to apologize because, compared to something that actually killed us, this kind of like, does it make us a little more lonely, felt a little bit more trivial. But you know what, I wouldn't say that now. I think if anything, we now are probably more aware of the kind of importance of connecting with people and the ways that online tools do and do not support that. So let's see. So the kind of high level framing is, we have a lot of anxiety as a society right now, and in the past 10 years, I would say, about social media and its implications for well-being, our ability to connect with other people, our ability to even communicate, loneliness, self-esteem. And to be honest, these concerns are really nothing new. That when we look historically at how new technologies have been treated in popular narratives when first introduced, we see these kind of dystopian narratives over and over and over again. The telephone, the television set, even writing itself, which we don't really even think of as a technology, was greeted with a lot of kind of skepticism when it was first introduced. Oh, I'm thinking about Socrates here. So when we look back at the scholarship on well-being and social media use, the early work really focused on kind of how much time are you spending using this thing. And over time, we've evolved to really understand that it's much more important to look at the kinds of use and the specific practices that people are doing to really understand well-being and other outcomes. And one distinction that has emerged as key in this literature is active versus passive use. You've probably heard this, right? Are you using social network sites actively, or just kind of this passive lurking? And this is true, by the way, for how we originally treated research on the internet in general as well, that we first focused on kind of just, are you online or not? And then realized, well, no, it really matters a lot more what you're actually doing, who you're connecting with, what kinds of activities you're doing. So the two mechanisms in the literature are social comparison and social connectedness. And I'm going to spend a little bit of time kind of talking about those two to give a sense of the kind of theoretical motivation for this work. And this is just kind of a compilation of studies to show you that this notion of active versus passive use is really dominant in the literature. And in fact, when we look at a 2017 kind of synthesis by Verdun et al., they are looking at kind of, whether social network sites enhance or undermine subjective well-being. And you can see that this piece that I've kind of highlighted talks about these two routes. One is passive and one is active. And in fact, this is a table from that paper where you can see up here, there's active use of social network sites that enhances social capital and connectedness, and it has a positive relationship with subjective well-being. And then passive use through this kind of mechanism of upward social comparison and envy. This is a negative sign leading to negatively affecting well-being, subjective well-being. And so to kind of do a little bit of a deep dive on this social connectedness piece, right? This is active, active use, and the DVs that this literature looks at are multiple, but they all, you can put them in the same bucket. Things like, relationship maintenance, social capital, social support. These are things that we can kind of measure as an outcome of our social media or technology use. And when you think about how these things might come about, this notion that active use is associated with them isn't surprising, right? If I want to access social capital, I need to share with my friends that I am in need of support, and then through clicks, they then offer me this emotional or informational advice. So this is all basically click-based. And one stream of work, as Michael mentioned, has focused on social capital implications of Facebook use. And as part of that, we decided to kind of look at one slice of activity, and this was broadcasting requests for help. So you may have seen something like this in your feed, a request for information, a recommendation. And here we're kind of focusing on broadcasting as an affordance of social network sites, right? This idea that we can kind of share to a large audience, much like radio or television, right? Like a mass media outlet. But these audiences are people we know, they know me, they can potentially respond with useful answers. You can see Cliff here, not all of the answers are as useful as others, but the point is not only am I accessing the informational resources of my network, but these people are all signaling to me that I'm important to them, right? That they took the time to kind of type out a response. And I'll put in a plug here for socio-technical approaches that look at both the social and the technical aspects of a particular phenomena for understanding its implications for humans. So when we look at responding to friends' questions, we see that they're productive. Empirically, we have some papers on this from a social capital perspective. And there's a number of things going on. So it's creating expectations of reciprocal behavior. It's helping with this kind of social grooming function, signaling these people are important to me. There's probably something with the algorithm going on that we don't really understand, but that it's making people, kind of surfaced in terms of the content that they're sharing. And then from a network perspective, when I share a post on a social network site, it goes only to my existing network. When I answer Michael's question, for instance, I am now making myself visible to all of his network. And so this, we know from Granovetter and others that these weak ties or friends of friends are important from an informational perspective. So kind of sidebar thinking about tech, I mentioned this broadcasting affordance. And this is this kind of affordance perspective is one that many comm scholars are embracing, and myself as well have found it very useful. And the idea here is that we're not trying to describe a particular platform at a particular point in time, but rather that we are kind of kicking our analysis up a level to think about higher level affordances being kind of things that these technologies allow us to do. And in theorizing at this level, we can produce scholarship that has value even after that technology has changed or gone out of business or whatever. So affordances would be things like persistence, searchability, right? And so, so here, when we're thinking about social network sites and sharing questions, that we have this ability to broadcast, much like earlier media, such as the telephone. But the difference here is that we're broadcasting to a network of people that we have some kind of connection with. And communication scholars have called this mass personal. So kind of a combination of mass and interpersonal. And in fact, when we look at, this is a copy of the earliest American newspaper, Public Occurrences, both foreign and domestic, and published in 1690. And it's described in the journalism textbooks as a four-page newspaper. But when you see a picture of it, it's only 3 pages. And this is because the last page was left blank for people to add their own news or opinions on and leave it at the tavern for the next person. So this notion that kind of broadcast, mass and interpersonal affordances are connected. This isn't necessarily new, but this is something we think of with social media. And of course, when we think about the affordances of a newspaper like this versus a Facebook post in terms of a bit interactivity, synchronicity, searchability, persistence, right? These are all attributes that we can associate with social media and which really kind of shape those interactions in important ways. So the second kind of mechanism that was in that Verdun chart is social comparison. And the idea here, so I talked about clicking being associated with these kind of beneficial social connectedness. Now we're going to focus on the kind of downside, right, which is social comparison. And this is associated with viewing, right? So viewing social media, friends, content, the literature suggests, sorry about my cat, leads to negative social comparison and self-esteem effects. And the idea here is that I am comparing myself to my peers, and they are posting only the great things that are happening to them. And if I don't have this awareness, I will negatively upwards compare myself to them and feel badly about myself or feel envious about myself. And then there's other kind of components about this as well. So the like paradox, they're getting more likes than me. Empirically, we know this. And that these are peers, they're not, kind of celebrities, right? They're more salient comparisons. So point being is that these two kind of streams have been treated as independent in the literature for the most part. And one of the things that we wanted to kind of play with in this project was to really move away from this kind of active versus passive dichotomy and to instead consider that interacting and viewing might be more productively conceived on a spectrum of high and low on both, as opposed to, just passive and just active. And when we do that, we have this kind of quadrant of 4 kinds of users, right? We have these four kinds of users, and with the idea that you can be high on one or low on the other, low on both or high on the other. And when we think about what the literature then would propose, right, with this, and I'm oversimplifying a bit, but with social connectedness, you are, you have to interact, right? So you're kind of high on interacting, regardless of whether you're actually viewing or not, okay? And when we think about, so the idea here is that we're clicking, but we don't necessarily know whether people are kind of authentically engaged. And I'll talk a little bit here just about eye contact or eye gaze, right? Which in face-to-face communication is how we communicate, how we show attention, right? How we show that we're listening, and we give out a lot of information that we're not even aware that we're processing as individuals through our gaze. And this may be one, reason why some of us feel fatigued online because we can't, those same cues about where people are looking are less evident. And when we think about how this translates in an online environment, you can't really tell whether someone is looking at or has been shown something unless you leave a visible trace, right? Unless you as a user click, comment, share, right? That these are all kind of signals that then are the only way that we can kind of communicate that we've seen or are kind of paying attention to content. And of course, this is how systems you decide what ads to show us. And we can think about different kinds of clicks and what is their value for social relationships. The happy birthday post is kind of the canonical signal or canonical example of social grooming. Social grooming, right, in primates being a way, literally picking nits off one another as a way to signal, to build trust, to kind of, signal liking, nurturing one another, reciprocity. And we can kind of think of happy birthday messages as a kind of modern day equivalent of that kind of social grooming. And then thinking about social comparison, this is, where you have to kind of view, right, to look, to feel this comparison. But again, the literature doesn't really speak to the extent to which interacting might affect that. And here we can see that platforms have kind of played with hiding likes as a way, because likes are such a salient, when you quantify something, it becomes much more easy to kind of compare. So number of likes being implicated in these kind of negative self-esteem dynamics. And as I said, most of the literature talks about upwards comparison in social media as having these negative implications. There is this piece that I'll point out by Adrian Meyer and colleagues that's looking at what are the conditions under which viewing images that actually results in kind of inspiration, right? Positive. And I will allow you to guess which of these two, and this is from their stimuli from their experiment, and I'll allow you to guess which of these two is pictures of leaves is more inspirational. But at any rate, so here we have this, again, this kind of quadrant of, interacting and viewing. And so what does that mean for someone who is then high on viewing and clicking, right? So the predictions from literature could go either way. Either they're benefiting from their poster, from their posting, or they're kind of taking a hit to their self-esteem from viewing, right? And one of the things that I want to suggest is that these two things may interact in ways that treating them independently doesn't allow us to see. So for instance, maybe when you see someone posting about something terrible that happened, something great that happened to them, and you feel obligated to write a comment, maybe that gets you out of your own, head, that benefiting other people is good for us, right? That this is less self-focused, that maybe some things are happening that we don't quite, can't quite predict. Maybe this is a very simple way of suggesting that maybe in some ways they're kind of canceling each other out. And when we look at recent meta-analyses, indeed, we do find that the kind of fear narratives about social media use are not necessarily supported. Here's a recent piece that finds that this association between digital technology and adolescent well-being explains 0.4% of the variation in well-being. So another kind of theoretical user type we consider is what we call the indiscriminate clicker, right? And from a social capital perspective, this person probably benefits in the short term, right? They're clicking, they're signaling attention to a lot of people, but they're not really paying attention. This is kind of the interpersonal equivalent of a click farm employee, right? And going back to our happy birthday example, right? We can think about the click, the happy birthday post, as a form of currency signaling attention, investment in a relationship, okay? Back in the olden days, you had to kind of, navigate to a person's page and type out a message. And so from thinking about like Donna's work on signaling theory, right? This is a pretty honest signal of attention when you're typing something out. Then Facebook kind of aggregated these all on one page, and it became a slightly less honest or cheaper signal of actual attention. And now we have tools like Birthday Buddy that tells us birthdays are important, make them special. Yet so special that the extension automatically posts a personalized birthday wish on your Facebook friends wall. So you don't even have to do anything, right? So if all of your thousands of social media contacts used an application like this to say happy birthday, that essentially becomes no signal at all, right? All right, and finally, sorry, I know I'm going kind of fast, but I do want to leave some time for discussion at the end. So hopefully you can keep up with me. So this last quadrant, these are people who are viewing, right? They're high on viewing. They spend a lot of time looking at content, but they don't click, right? They don't comment, they don't click, they don't leave a trace. And we might expect that this would, from the literature, we would predict that this would have poor well-being outcomes, right? Because they're not doing the things that we know benefit us. But our kind of speculation points to one scenario where this might actually be more powerful in terms of social connectedness. And the example I'll share with you is this post of my dog Coco when she was a puppy. And I had people who didn't post, didn't like, didn't leave any trace, yet the next day in the office, back when that was a thing, came up to me and said, "Oh, I saw you got a puppy. She's so cute. What are you going to name her?" And so from a social capital, kind of social relational investment perspective, this was actually a much stronger signal because they saw it, they remembered it, right? They brought it up, and we had a whole interaction around it. So even though from a kind of, trace data perspective, this interaction didn't exist, right? Even Facebook doesn't know when people come up to you in the hall and talk to you about something. It still is very kind of powerful if we're thinking about interpersonal relationships. Okay, so now to the empirical piece. This paper, as I said, is published in the Journal of Computer-Mediated Communication, and it is co-authored with Penny Trio, Robin Brewer, Arthi Israni, and Sarita Schonebeck, all faculty or students at the School of Information at U of M. Penny is now at Google. She graduated last year. So the research questions that are kind of powering this study. So one is that we were interested in understanding what was the relationship between viewing and clicking, right? And the way that we kind of operationalized this was to use eye tracking to show people their Facebook feed and to calculate how long they looked at particular content and to also then capture whether they clicked on it or not, right? So we might predict that people are spending a lot of time looking at stuff they click at and kind of, no time at things that they weren't, that they didn't click on, and that's not what we found. And then we also combined this eye tracking data with interview data, where we really wanted to understand in users' own kind of words and how they understood what a click was, right? So what kind of guided their decisions to click or not click on content in Facebook was our kind of research focus. And we invited University of Michigan staff to come into the lab. We had a gender balance and tried to recruit a diverse sample. You can see age-wise, we were okay with that. These were, sports coaches, administrative assistants, custodians. So pretty, lots of different kinds of people, not undergrads. And they came into the lab where we had an eye tracking device set up on a desktop computer. We calibrated them. We had them browse their an exciting university webpage for 2 minutes to get used to the environment. And then we asked them to engage in a 7-minute Facebook session where we asked them, so the instructions were to look at your Facebook newsfeed and interact with it as you normally would, including any liking or commenting. And unlike other studies where participants were instructed to be either, active or passive, we really wanted to kind of understand their natural behaviors. So we just told them to do what you would normally do. And then we recorded the content of their feed and where their eye gaze landed, and also whether they clicked or not. And so this is an example of the eye clicking data. And you can see that essentially it's these dots are where the gaze was, and when the bigger the dot, the longer the gaze. This is someone who is not gazing very long at any one particular thing. Okay, so we didn't code the entire 7 minutes. We divided it into 3 bins and then sampled from each of those. So we had 21 posts per participant. And then, we also did an interview where we asked them some questions about recall and also about their, experience referring to the logs during that time, and then had them fill out a survey. Okay, so the first question was, what was the relationship between viewing, so duration of eye gaze associated with each piece of content in their feed, and clicking? Okay, and clicking was anything that left a visible trace for other users. Okay, so scrolling or clicking through a photo album wasn't counted as a click, but liking a photo would be. And when we compared clicked posts with unclicked posts in a linear mixed model to account for the nested nature of the data, right? Because we had multiple data points for each participant, we found that there was actually no significant difference in time spent gazing on content that they clicked on or didn't click on. They did spend more time looking at content that they later commented on. And I just want to point out that we stopped counting when they started typing. So it's not just, this isn't just an artifact that it takes longer to type. Okay, so this is kind of the big quant piece that people are not, that they're spending the same time looking at clicked and unclicked content. And then we turn now to the interview data and wondering, how people kind of understand their own clicking and viewing practices, and then kind of focusing in on this idea of the non-click, like the non-click as a thing that you purposefully do, right? And so we, in a kind of thematic analysis, we found that there were 3 audience-related concerns associated with non-clicks. So do I want the person to see this click, the poster? Do I want our networks to see the click? And then the third kind of audience was the platform itself. Do I want the platform to see this click? So, and I'll start out by just saying, of course, it's not the case that we are expecting people to click on every single piece of content. And people do, of course, say that, sometimes it's really not necessary, right? Unless it's, this amazing cat video, I'm not going to click on every cat video I see. So what we're interested in is instances where people did attend to it. They did think it was, interesting or worthy in some way, but they decided not to click, right? That was a deliberate decision. And so the first audience I talked about was the recipient, right? So this is the poster, the person who posted that piece of content. And they didn't, so one reason that our participants talked about was that they didn't want to seem to endorse certain kinds of posts or behavior, right? So one person talked about, if someone is their kid won the softball game and they're just only talking about how great their kid was and not the team, I'm not gonna click on that, right? Or another related instance was that these non-clickers didn't want to be accountable or call attention to their activities. So here we have one quote who says, one participant who says, as a male person, I might notice pictures, but I try not to give the impression that I'm noticing pictures, right? Because sometimes it would be inappropriate for me to click like on their bathing suit picture. I'm going to scroll past it, even if I noticed it, because they might be looking for that attention, but not from me. Or another person who talked about kind of going deep into people's feeds because she was kind of curious about them. And she talked about how that wasn't socially acceptable, right? That was kind of creepy to like someone's picture from 3 years ago that you just met. And then the second kind of bucket of audience motivations driving non-click decisions was about the network, right? And so this would be either my friend network, the poster's friend network, or the kind of community at large. So here, this is, I think we can kind of think of this as privacy concerns to some extent, that I don't want everyone seeing my comments. Here's one person who just says, I don't click anything, and even talks about how someone said, hey, why don't you like my stuff? And I said, I don't like stuff. And they said, yeah, but you like other people's stuff. So they've been watching and tracking. And so at this point, the person said, I'm just going to stay away from any clicking. Because I don't want to have to justify why I liked something and didn't like something else. And then the third kind of big audience bucket is the platform itself. So this is where people talked about the algorithm, right? About being conscious of the algorithm, seeing what they click on and kind of feeding them more of that, right? So here's someone who's talking about how they second guess themselves clicking on a diabetes site because they didn't want to get more ads. Here's another person talking about baby pictures and why she says, I can't like any more of those pictures. I want that baby out of my feed. I've seen that baby so much and I've never seen them in real life. So again, it's people, being aware of this notion that clicking trains the algorithm and you'll get more of that stuff, and wanting to be invisible from that perspective. And then I showed you the picture of Coco and talked about how people had, mentioned her to me the other day. And we had this in our data as well. So here we have a woman saying that she went to Peru with her daughter and posted some vacation pictures, and that she noticed that people use that as what she calls a conversation starter, and that she liked this, right? She says, if you're actually noticing that I posted this picture and you can bring it up later on and talk with me about it, clearly there's some level of interest. There's a greater connection there. It's so easy to like something on Facebook. It's just, you're just doing it to be polite. I would rather you mention it to me in real life. You actually want real people to interact with you. How many likes something gets is not super important. So here, again, from a kind of relational investment, social grooming, social signaling perspective, this is more valuable as a signal of attention, and yet invisible from a kind of trace data, method perspective. And I'll talk about that as one of what I think the contributions of this piece are. First, I want to talk about two theoretical implications, and then I'll finish with a design implication. So I'll just kind of go through these. So I think the first is maybe as a nudge to researchers to kind of rethink this simple, passive versus active paradigm, that this was one of the kind of trends in the literature that we were responding to. And our findings suggest that social media scholarship should consider other approaches to categorizing user activity above and beyond this kind of dichotomous and limiting active versus passive distinction. So we see that there was no significant difference in viewing time between clicked and non-clicked content. And our interview data also talk about the fact that, people were really kind of had this notion of the non-click as an intentional act that resulted from conscious and thoughtful engagement, even, with content that they paid attention to. And So we also kind of think about the interpersonal aspects of this and well-being perspective. And when I say cross-channel interactions, I mean, you see content in a social network site and then you pick up the phone or you mention it to the person the next day in the hall or you send a text, and that those are actually stronger signals of relational investment than clicks. So thinking about this kind of, I talked a little bit about, this kind of being a passive framing, right? That this person doing this, picking up the phone instead of clicking would be coded as passive, right? By any social media researcher, depending solely on the trace data set. But now we also want to suggest that maybe active uses of Facebook also would benefit from some more theoretical refinement, given how people are actually using these sites and the platform affordances. So for instance, posting is usually operationalized as direct communication, but when we think about it, maybe that post is hidden by the algorithm, who knows? Maybe the post is ignored. And in fact, that would actually lead to well-being declines, right? You feel badly if you ask a question and no one answers it. Maybe we want to focus more on what that content is, right? Not just that it's a click or not. And with the kind of requests for help is being one example of that. And then often commenting and posting are kind of put into the same bucket, but they're really very different. From many perspectives. I mentioned the network aspect is one, right? That there's a difference between posting to your own group of friends versus posting, commenting on a friend's, where you're then being visible to their network. We spend a little bit of time talking about the interpersonal implications of this non-click and channel switching, and essentially that our participants kind of sometimes engaged in this gratuitous liking and commenting. And, that when we think about how these click infrastructures have evolved historically, where we're really removing friction, right? We're making it so easy for people to click that at a certain point, maybe that click becomes useless from a kind of interpersonal perspective. So one suggestion we make is maybe platform designers might want to introduce friction back into these relational investment gestures on social media to increase the strength of the signal. So for instance, I had a birthday last week, and I really noticed when people, instead of just saying, HBD, they took the time to find a photo of the two of us from the past and share that instead. And so that was, less friction, but more meaningful. And this is, I'm going to skip this because I want to have time for questions at the end. So yeah, and again, just here we're kind of talking about how we signal authentic attention, and that it's not just based on, on clicks. So this kind of leads to the methodological implications of the non-click, right? And I'm in a school of information. I work with a lot of computer scientists. I understand the excitement about click data and, the idea that it represents this kind of gold standard of behavioral data when we compare it to self-report. But I do point out that, if we're relying on click data alone, we may be missing really critical aspects of what we really should more productively conceive of as kind of an ecosystem of different platforms and different communication channels. And one way that we can kind of, so then of course the question becomes, well, how do we study the non-click if it doesn't exist? And one thing that one approach is to do kind of, multi-channel studies where you are not just focusing on Facebook only, but rather also asking about, text messages or face-to-face interactions or picking up the phone or, Snapchat or Instagram or email, and kind of really thinking about this as the notion that oftentimes these pieces interactions can start in one platform and move to other platforms. And if you're only asking about, Twitter or Facebook or Snapchat or whatever it is, you're really missing out on that. And I say this as someone who has done dozens of these studies, but I'm trying not to. And then, of course, multi-method, I think, focusing, acknowledging that server level data may not give you the entire, story, but that it's important to kind of, as we did here, look at other talk to people, for instance, about how they understand their own use. And maybe there's other techniques as well. I know, for instance, there was, you can ask people what they regret posting, or using server level data to explore posts that were typed out but not posted. So there are some other techniques. And then finally, thinking about design implications, right? So, and this is a little bit more kind of high level. I'm not just talking about the design of one platform, but kind of how we as a society think about what we pay attention to. And so here's a picture of a desire path. And the idea is that these footsteps, right, through the grassy area show where pathways should be built, because this is where people actually walked. And I think the same idea is used often when platforms are deciding kind of what content to surface, right? So if other people have clicked on it, let's show it to more people, right? In the same way. And of course, we know this is how they work, right? Facebook tells you if you want to know why you're seeing something, it's because you've clicked on other things, or other people have clicked on things and they think it'll be important to you. But really what I want to ask here is kind of what are the logic, what are the consequences of this logic, right? That assumes that clicks represent attention or value, right? Like what happens when we move this metaphor online? And the story that kind of prompted some of this work. So this is a Facebook group that I'm in. This is from a couple years ago. I'm sharing this with permission. I took out the person's name. And really what happened was a group of academic mothers, and a woman posted a story about how, and the article was written by a woman of color about how she felt invisible in society. And the post got very little interaction. And then essentially kind of disappeared, okay? And then at the same time, another post was shared that got a lot of attention, and it was something very silly. It was a picture of a spider, okay? And then the next day, this woman wrote to the group and said, I've been thinking about, and I should say that then people kind of started noticing, hey, why did no one comment on this picture about this woman of color feeling invisible? What happened there? And so this is the reflection that one of the members shared the next day. And she says, I've been thinking about this recent case where a post with an article about Black women being invisible was itself apparently invisible. I think that one thing that might be contributing to the problem is that it's kind of difficult to know whether or how to respond to posts about oppressed groups as a member of the oppressing group. I take it as one thing that what we should not do is respond with our own personal take on the story, our excuses, how shocked we are. My strategy was to read and learn and be quiet, but now I am worried that this isn't helpful because the Facebook algorithm reacts to reactions. So this diminishes visibility, and because this is indistinguishable to the poster from ignoring. And so then she goes on to say, what's the best thing to do on Facebook to kind of signal boost or show that you're listening without taking up space, right? Liking is not appropriate. Let's talk about this as a group and figure it out. And so the question then that we ask is, how do we want to account or allow people to express this notion that this is important content. I want other people to see it. I thought about it. I'm not taking up space in this conversation, but it's important, but I don't want to click on it. And to then not have that post basically kind of disappear when the platform says, oh, hey, no one's clicking on this, it must not be important. And so we suggest here at the end, sorry for the wall of text, but we suggest at the end that, stories about kind of complex and difficult social phenomena may fade out of social media feeds because people don't have, the time to post a comment, or maybe they don't know what to say. They don't want to just post a potentially inappropriate reaction, and that, non-clicks on this more kind of complex content may inadvertently train these algorithms to highlight content that's easy to respond to, right? Like the spider poster, you could just hit honey, funny, haha, and move on. And so here, well, I'll just end with this point that more scholarly attention should be paid to the social and political implications of these algorithmic logics that assume clicking alone can identify worthy content. And we also kind of articulate this call for action that platforms should really think about: how do you design for listening, right? How can you as a user say, this is important, but I don't want to become a speaker in this conversation. It's not my place. I want to listen. I want to learn from it. It's important, but none of these options are appropriate. And I will say that these data were collected before the Facebook Care reaction was introduced, and I do think that does some of this work. So I will end with that. Here's kind of some high-level points and a link to the paper, which I know you can't click on, but you can search for non-click Ellison JCMC. I can also put it in chat. And I am going to, I guess, stop sharing my screen so that I can see people. And thank you very much.
I'll kick one off while folks are prepping. First of all, I really love the idea of thinking about other signaling mechanisms. That's, I think, a thing that we've really not gotten very deep in the design of these systems. And I really think there's something there. My question is around you coming back to your initial observation, which is totally right, that we have things like tie strength and well-being being as a result in many ways of costly communication, right? The social grooming analysis, the honest signals, all of this is sort of saying that when I put effort and time into something, that's what makes clear that I value you because I've done it. And when you split out your 2x2, there was still some implication that, yes, there might be other values, but at the same time, the non-click is still not perceived as costly, right? So if I'm not doing anything that you can see, if you're the poster, it's not a costly communication. With the exception of the one case that you pointed out where someone brings it offline, but that's probably already between a strong tie, right? Because we're meeting up in person. So I'm just wondering, is there hope still here for non-clicks leading to good well-being results? Or do you feel that do we wind up in the same position at the end of the day, that essentially what was being called low activity here, I'm just focusing on non-clicks, is it still just winding up with ultimately I'm not engaging in costly communication, so we're not building tie strength. I'm not engaging in the well-being behaviors that help in the long term.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're assuming that this kind of cross-channel communication happens primarily or maybe only with strong ties, and I would say that's not what our data suggested. And so the kind of meeting someone in the hallway, knock on wood that'll be a thing at some point. I mean, those aren't necessarily strong ties, but you might be, Facebook friends with colleagues from work. That would be one example. The other instance that people talked about in the data that I recall is when they wanted kind of more of a interaction. And so with, like, say, an old high school friend, for instance, this would be something where maybe they wouldn't text the person, because I think that does imply you have their phone number, right? But like Facebook moving from a Facebook post and comment to a messenger interaction. So I think there probably is a little bit more wiggle room in terms of tie strength and who people are doing this kind of platform hopping around. But I do think that you're, I like the kind of motivation of thinking about how can the non-click, what are other ways that we can signal attention if we don't want if we don't want to say tell Facebook, if we don't want to click for other reasons, other than that kind of bringing it into another channel. I mean, there's also kind of interesting work that I know Hancock has done, like with this idea that when you see content and then you kind of seamlessly blend it into conversations as a way of kind of ingratiating yourself with the person. So he did that study, right, where they looked up at someone's profile about what their favorite hamburger was or band or whatever, and then in an interaction where they were told to make that person like you, they were they were able to kind of blend those into the conversation. So I could see that as another way of this information being used that's not associated with just like a cheap like.
I will. I really appreciated this work. It's gone into a lot more depth than I've heard about on this before, especially that, the passive stuff is not necessarily negative. Really, really interesting. I wonder if you've also done some work on secondary effects, like if there's a negative feedback loop, that if you see that there's already been so many likes, you sort of think that's enough and don't like it yourself. Or if you see there haven't been any for this person's cat or their workout or whatever, that you're more likely to do it. Or if you see that there's been a whole lot of comments about, that's a really cute blue, and there's really nothing more to say about it, you might not say something. Whereas, so what people have already done affect what people do in reaction in the future.
Yeah, so I think that's probably, so I think that's a great question. The work we've done focuses that speaks to that, I think most directly, is the question asking. And where we saw, depending on the kind of question, there were differences in kind of the number of responses. So for instance, if it's a straight informational factual question, you only need one answer, right? You need the right factual answer, and then you wouldn't expect to see 20 other people repeating the same thing. For something like recommendations or advice, right, where a diversity of perspectives is really what you want, that's where we would see more responses coming in. So I guess I think you're totally I think the intuition is right, and I would say that the only way that we've kind of empirically studied that particular question is through the differences in the kinds that we did a study where we kind of coded the different kinds of questions and the responses and had people rate how useful the responses were. And I think that's where different kinds of questions kind of, demand different kinds of answers or different numbers of answers.
So I'll bring up a couple questions from folks who joined. One is, I'll paraphrase it, asking around how these same questions are going to get transformed in live or sort of synchronous interactions, things like Clubhouse, where it's happening at the same time rather than in this asynchronous manner. Is there going to be a similar notion of how these sort of click or non-click interactions might play out? How are the mechanisms here gonna unroll?
Yeah, so I think the difference, right, with I'm thinking of Clubhouse and synchronous audio is that only one person can speak at a time. So there is, so this idea that 50 people could comment or like without affecting the other people's ability to comment or like, right, is pretty different. So I think, I think part of it would kind of depend on platform itself and how it's, allowing people to signal attention or not. But, and I don't know I'm trying to remember with Clubhouse, I've only played with it a bit, but I don't know that there's ways of kind of, clicking in the same, endorsing in the same way that you could with Facebook. So I think the important piece there would be looking at the affordance of synchronicity and how with asynchronous communication, you don't have those limits or constraints on who can participate in the same way you do with a forum like this, right? Only one person can talk at a time.
Excellent. And one final one, noting that we're just about at time. He's referring to the emotional contagion study, looking at how essentially posts can have small scale effects on our emotional states. And his question is focused on when something will have sort of like a positive contagion, sort of inspiration, rather than creating jealousy, as he puts it. So you gave this example, sort of like, nice photos of leaves versus bad photos of leaves, or photos of a vacation making me feel relaxed rather than jealous. And I think underlying his question seems to be sort of like, well, what are there ways to differentiate these uses? And are there also different kinds of signals that get used in each case?
Yeah, so I mean, I think there's probably two things that we would look at. One would be the kind of content itself. So in that case, it was the imagery and how kind of evocative and visually appealing the thing that people were responding to. But then I think it's probably also useful to look at the comment stream and the interactions there, and that would really that I could see that also affecting how you as a viewer, your emotional response to a post and a set of responses. And this I think is probably, and then also I think, yourself as an audience to yourself, and the fact that you type it, you don't want to be an ass and say something mean, so you type in something supportive, and in doing that, then how does that affect your own kind of emotional state at that moment? So yeah, this is probably not a good answer. I think it's a great question. I'm hopeful that we'll see more work that kind of is able to parse out those kinds of details. And I think the interaction is critical to look at, and also very hard to manipulate in an experiment almost.
Yes.
Yeah.
Excellent. Why don't we call it here? Thank you so much for joining us.